I've always been the kind of person who finds comfort in order. From the time I was young, I planned out every step in life, finding security in knowing exactly where I was headed. That all seemed to solidify when I met Rachel during college. It felt like fate had handed me exactly what I needed. She was everything I dreamed of, intelligent, gorgeous, and driven. On the surface, we appeared to have it all together, a perfect match. Our careers took off, we bought a beautiful house, and raised two wonderful kids. But somewhere along the way, our marriage started to crumble. I can't pinpoint the exact moment it began, but maybe it was the long hours we both put into work, or perhaps the emotional distance that grew between us over the years. Those tiny fractures became wide divides, chasms too large for either of us to cross. That's how I found myself sitting across from a marriage counselor after 26 years, wondering if there was anything left worth saving, or if it was time to walk away from what seemed completely broken. Now, I'm here, sitting next to the woman I've been married to for 26 years, Rachel. I can't quite grasp what I'm feeling. Confused, sad, angry, but also strangely empty. There's something missing that I can't name. The only thing I know for sure is that the love I once had for the woman sitting beside me is no longer there. As I sit there, lost in my thoughts, I wonder if it's even worth the effort anymore. Maybe it's better to just let it all go. I guess I'll find out once she speaks. Before I go any further, let me introduce myself. My name's Jack Thompson, I'm 50 years old, and I've been married to Rachel for 26 long years. We've raised two incredible kids, Ryan and Jessica. Ryan is a freshman at a small university, studying engineering while playing football on a scholarship. Jessica, our oldest, is in her second year at Florida State University, working toward a pharmacy degree. We couldn't be prouder of them. Rachel and I first met like a lot of couples back in the late 80s, at a college party. It was my junior year at the University of Tennessee. The party was an open event at a fraternity house, and I was in the backyard with some friends when I spotted her on the porch, cigarette in hand. Even from a distance, I could tell she was stunning. Her long, dark hair framed an athletic, graceful figure, but it was her eyes that truly captivated me. Those piercing green eyes seemed to hold the depth of an entire ocean. I couldn't look away, and I'm sure I looked like an idiot, standing there mesmerized. Eventually, my buddy Derek noticed my zoning out and elbowed me. "Dude, are you just going to stare? Or are you actually going to talk to her?" His words snapped me back to reality, and I figured I should at least try. But before I could even move, she flashed me a quick smile and disappeared back into the house. Derek urged me to follow her, but by the time I made my way through the crowd, she was gone. I saw her get into a car with some friends and drive off. For almost 2 years, I thought about that brief smile, wondering if I'd ever see her again. The University of Tennessee is a huge place, so it wasn't all that surprising that I couldn't find her again, no matter how much time I spent searching. Derek even started eating lunch with me at different spots around campus, hoping we might cross paths with her. By the time senior year rolled around, I had pretty much given up on ever seeing her again. I was focused on my finance degree, and big firms in Nashville were already offering me positions. My life was falling into place. Then, one day, everything changed. I was sitting at a red light, waiting for it to turn green, when I spotted her again. About 200 yards away, sitting at an outdoor table, smoking. I couldn't believe it was her at first, but the moment the light changed, and the cars behind me started honking, she turned to look in my direction. That's when I knew. It was definitely her. Without thinking, I parked my car right there, left it, and started walking toward her. The angry drivers behind me didn't matter. I had to meet her. When I got close, she gave me a confused look, clearly trying to remember where she'd seen me before. Then, she stood up, put out her cigarette, and walked right over. We were just inches apart when she said, "I'm Rachel. You should have gotten my number that night." I was stunned. All I could manage to say was, "I tried, but you were already gone." She laughed and handed me a piece of paper with her number on it. "Don't lose it. Oh, and you might want to move your car before it gets towed." As I turned to leave, she surprised me with a quick kiss on the cheek and said, "Call me soon." Later that night, we talked for hours. Rachel told me she had only been on campus that day to meet her friend. I explained how I had been looking for her ever since that party, and she admitted she'd thought about me too, wondering why the guy who stared at her never made a move. We laughed, and she confessed that her search for me had even caused her to break up with her boyfriend at the time. Our first date lasted until nearly 2 a.m., ending with a kiss on her doorstep. As I drove home that night, I had a feeling she was the one. The next morning when I called her, she teased, "What took you so long?" Confused, I replied, "It's only been 7 hours since I dropped you off." She laughed and said she'd been up all night talking to her friend about me. We went out again that same evening. By the time the second date ended, things had heated up. Over dinner, Rachel suggested with a playful grin, "Why don't we skip the bar and head back to my place? It'll be quieter and well closer to my bed." Intrigued, I agreed. We barely touched the wine once we got back. 2 days later, we finally emerged from her apartment, having spent nearly the whole time together. That was the beginning of everything. I was absolutely wiped out and crashed for a solid 10 hours, curled up next to her. If Sam hadn't woken us up, we would have completely missed class on Monday. From that point on, Rachel and I were inseparable. I spent nearly every moment at the apartment she shared with Sam. My roommate Derek was thrilled about it. He and his girlfriend Sarah finally had our place to themselves. We all graduated that spring and managed to land good jobs in Nashville. I became a junior financial analyst, Rachel started in advertising, and Sam went on to law school, eventually becoming a well-known attorney in downtown Nashville. The biggest shocker was Derek and Sarah. They joined the Metro Police Department, which seemed totally out of character for them, given their laid-back personalities. But Derek explained that they wanted a career that would help them grow up, and law enforcement seemed like the best option. Despite our different paths, our group stayed incredibly close. We got together regularly, especially during football season. Saturdays were sacred for Titans games. Barbecues, tailgates, going out to restaurants, or just watching movies together. It was the kind of tight-knit bond most people only dream about. Life was, by all accounts, good for all of us. One evening, Rachel and I were sitting out on the back patio, sipping drinks and reflecting on how far we'd come. We had it all: money in the bank, a beautiful home, nice cars, and amazing vacations, both with friends and just the two of us. I had moved up to vice president of finance in my company, and I had my sights set on a corner office. Rachel had climbed her way to director of regional marketing for a major athletic brand and seemed like she was thriving in her career. At least, that's what I thought. While taking a sip of her sparkling wine, she looked at me with that familiar glint in her eyes and said, "Have you noticed I quit smoking a few months ago?" I smiled, nodding. "Yeah, but I didn't want to mention it, in case it tempted you to pick it back up." She grinned for a moment, but then her face turned more serious. "That's not the only thing I've stopped," she added quietly. I was puzzled. "What else?" I asked. For a moment, she hesitated, then softly replied, "I've also stopped taking birth control." "We're going to have a baby?" My mind raced, a mixture of excitement and fear. The idea of becoming a father again after all these years was both thrilling and terrifying. It felt like the start of a whole new chapter in our lives. Now, I'm the president of my company, which has grown into a powerhouse, pulling in over $150 million a year with consistent growth of 15% annually. I earn a generous salary, with bonuses regularly reaching 200% of my base pay. People often credit our success to my sharp financial mind, but in truth, I think it's my appetite for risk that brought us this far. Rachel is now the senior vice president of marketing at the same company, leading an entire division and overseeing the southeastern region. We've made wise investments in the stock market, and on some days, we earn more in a single trade than what we used to make in a year combined. Our bank account sits at over $18 million, and our future couldn't seem brighter. Our kids, who have been our focus for the last 22 years, have now graduated and are excelling in their careers. Everything seemed to be perfect, but then life threw us a curveball. It was a Friday night, and I was on our back porch with a cold beer, listening to some old blues. Rachel had just gotten home from a week-long work retreat up in the Smoky Mountains with her team. I've always hated those retreats. No cell service, no contact. It drove me crazy. I heard her set her wine glass down on the table next to me, followed by the unmistakable sound of a lighter flicking. I opened my eyes, confused, and saw her lighting a cigarette. She hadn't smoked in nearly 20 years. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. Her once bright green eyes were now hollow, empty, like I'd never seen before. I didn't say anything at first. I just waited for her to speak. She took a long drag from her cigarette, a deep sip of wine, then finally looked me dead in the eye. "I cheated on you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." My mind went blank. I felt a surge of rage, hurt, and disbelief all at once. I couldn't process it. "What did you just say?" I managed to choke out. She lowered her head and repeated it. "I cheated on you, Jack. I'm sorry." The anger I felt was like nothing I'd ever experienced. This woman, Rachel, the only woman I had ever truly loved, had betrayed me. I couldn't even form a response. All I wanted to do was lash out. I needed to hurt her the way she had hurt me. But instead, I managed to pull myself together, stood up, and walked inside. I couldn't be near her. I needed space. I didn't return that night. I didn't even grab my phone. I just got in my car and drove. Meanwhile, Rachel stayed on the back porch, waiting. At first, she thought I had gone inside to cool off, maybe grab another beer. But when I didn't return, she assumed I had gone to bed. After a while, she went inside to find me, but by then, I was long gone. She called my phone, but it buzzed on the kitchen counter. I hadn't taken it with me. That night, she cried herself to sleep, curled up alone in the house we had built together. The next morning, I still hadn't come back, and she started to worry. We had never gone more than a day without talking in 27 years. But this time was different. Feeling desperate, Rachel called Sam, her closest friend of nearly 30 years. Sam sensed the urgency in Rachel's voice and rushed over. When she arrived, she found Rachel in our bedroom, still crying, the stench of cigarette smoke lingering in the air. Sam wrapped her in a hug and asked, "Did Jack cheat on you?" Rachel couldn't speak, just nodded through her sobs. Sam, understanding instantly, whispered, "It was you, wasn't it?" Rachel broke down completely, admitting, "I betrayed him. I ruined everything." Sam held her while she cried, staying until Rachel fell asleep, her body exhausted from the emotions. When Rachel woke up a couple of hours later, Sam was still there, reading a magazine. Gently, she asked if Rachel wanted anything to eat or drink, or if she needed to talk. Rachel wasn't hungry, but she did want a glass of wine. I poured my heart out to Sam, telling her everything from the retreat up until she arrived. She listened without interrupting, showing the kind of understanding only a true friend could offer. When I finished, she reassured me, "You and Jack will get through this. We'll all be here for you. You, Jack, me, Derek, and Sarah. That's what real friends are for." As the evening dragged on, it became clear Jack wasn't coming back anytime soon. I called Ryan and Jessica to see if they'd heard from him, but neither of them had. I lied, saying he'd probably gone off with some old friends for the weekend. They were a bit annoyed, but I reassured them, pretending that Jack had mentioned it to me, and I'd simply forgotten. That night, Sam stayed over. We sat up drinking wine until I eventually passed out, our home feeling so different, strangely empty and far quieter than it had been just 48 hours earlier. Sunday came and went, and Jack was still nowhere to be found. Sam and I spent the day drowning our sorrows in more wine, tears occasionally spilling over between conversations. On Monday, I called my boss and asked for a few days off, blaming my exhaustion on the retreat. He was understanding and told me to take the week. But as the hours stretched on, Jack still hadn't reached out. By Tuesday, Sam suggested we needed extra help. She called Nancy, Jack's executive assistant. Nancy had been more than just an assistant. She'd practically run Jack's life for over a decade. She told us Jack had sent an email from a private account, saying he was taking 2 weeks off and wouldn't be reachable by phone or email. Hearing that broke me completely. I cried for hours, realizing we were deeper into this mess than I could have imagined. Desperate, Sam called Derek and Sarah, who rushed over that evening. They listened to the whole story, asking questions with a level of focus that reminded me of their years on the force. When I begged them for help, Derek looked me in the eye and said firmly, "I'll find Jack, if it's the last thing I do." Then he added with a fire in his voice, "And I'll make sure that guy who's responsible for this Whoever he is pays for what he's done. Meanwhile, I had found myself in Key West, Florida, with no real plan. I'd never been there before, didn't know anyone in the area, and had no idea why I'd driven so far south. I just kept heading in that direction until there was no more road left. I checked into a cheap motel near the beach, paying for 2 weeks up front with cash, and isolated myself. I didn't want Rachel to find me, and I needed time. Time to think, to figure out what to do next. I used only cash, never my credit cards, and emailed Nancy from the hotel's computer, saying I was taking a break and wouldn't be available for a while. I needed space after Rachel's devastating confession, but being alone with my thoughts felt like torture. Every dark thought I'd ever had about her and this unknown man played on a loop in my mind. Was he better than me? Did our friends know and laugh behind my back? I tried to drown those thoughts in alcohol, staying drunk as much as I could. Key West is a place where no one cares if you're drunk at 9 a.m., and I took full advantage of that. I wore the same clothes every day, let my beard grow out, and didn't care what I looked like. After a few days, I no longer saw the successful CEO of a multimillion-dollar company when I looked in the mirror. I saw a broken, bitter, and reeking mess wandering the streets aimlessly. I had fallen so far, I didn't even recognize myself anymore. Finding Jack turned out to be harder than Derek and Sarah anticipated. It was like he had vanished into thin air. They tried tracing his credit and bank cards, but there were no transactions anywhere. Security cameras had captured him driving south on I-75, but after the highway cameras ended, so did Jack's trail. They figured he was somewhere in southern Georgia or maybe even Florida, but tracking a black BMW in that region was like looking for a needle in a haystack. It was too common. As a last resort, Derek called in a favor with a friend at the Florida Highway Patrol, requesting a bolo, be on the lookout, for Jack as a person of interest. With some help from his captain, this was as close as they could get to using official resources to find him. Meanwhile, Sarah focused on the man she thought was involved, Peter. Within hours, she had gathered everything she needed to know about him. She grabbed his phone from Rachel in a panic and, with Derek's encouragement, decided to crack it. Sam reminded them it wasn't legal, but Sarah was driven by her need for justice. "I don't care," she muttered. She was relentless. It only took her 4 minutes to crack Peter's password. It was his birthday in reverse. Sarah dug into his messages and found a link to someone named AK, a known dealer who sold drugs like ecstasy and rohypnol. Determined to bring Peter down, Sarah roped in a couple of friends from the force. They started tailing Peter and AK, bending the law just enough to keep things unofficial. On their first night out, they spotted Peter buying pills from AK at a club. Sarah and her friends lured him in, pretending to be partygoers. Peter, thinking he was slick, tried to spike Sarah's drink with something, but they caught him on video. Once they had the proof they needed, they arrested him on the spot, breaking his nose in the process. Sarah's vow for revenge had been fulfilled, but Jack was still missing, and the clock was ticking. They needed to find him before he made a decision he couldn't take back. Meanwhile, I was still wandering the bars of Key West. Making friends there was easy when you didn't care about anything. Within a week, I knew more people in those bars than I ever knew in Nashville. But no matter how many drinks I shared with strangers, or how familiar the bartenders became, I couldn't shake the emptiness. I still felt lost, completely shattered inside. I knew deep down that I couldn't run from my problems forever, but I had no idea what my next move should be. That was the night I met Grace. I was sitting at the bar, drinking and drowning in my own misery, when she slid onto the stool next to me. She introduced herself as Grace, but in my head, I wondered who in the world names their kid Grace anymore. She was 23, short with bright blonde hair, and had this bubbly, carefree attitude. There was something about her smile that made me uneasy, but she exuded a brazen confidence. Without hesitation, she looked at me and said, "Jack, let's take a walk on the beach." A part of me froze, thinking about Rachel, my vows, my life. This wasn't who I was. But despite every reservation that screamed at me to decline, I found myself taking her hand and walking out the door. We walked quietly for about 40 minutes, eventually reaching a quiet, secluded stretch of beach. Along the way, Grace picked up a small bottle of whiskey from a liquor store. We sat down in the sand, and she began asking about my life, my kids, my job, my hobbies. She listened closely, never judging, but she didn't mention Rachel at all. After about an hour of talking, she handed me the bottle and asked, "What's your wife's name?" I hesitated for a moment before answering. "What makes you think I'm married?" She smiled knowingly. "I've been watching you for a few days now. That empty look in your eyes? It only comes from someone who's been hurt by someone they love. Plus, you're still wearing your wedding ring. So, did she pass away? Or did she cheat?" Quietly, I replied, "She cheated. Her name is Rachel, and she told me last week." We sat in silence, passing the bottle back and forth. Finally, Grace asked, "Do you still love her?" I thought about it for a moment and said, "Yeah, I do. That's why it hurts so much." "Tell me what happened," she whispered. So, I did. I shared bits and pieces of my story, from meeting Rachel all those years ago to leaving Nashville in a state of shock. When I finished, we sat there, wordlessly taking in the sound of the waves. After a while, Grace broke the silence, saying, "Do you want to hear my story? It might help." Curious, I nodded. "Sure. I've got nothing but time." For the next hour, Grace told me her life story. She grew up in a small, forgotten part of Florida, far away from the tourist hotspots. A two-room trailer was considered a luxury there. Her dad, who was 54 when she was born, took off shortly after. He had called her Grace, but her real name was Tanya, a name she preferred. Her mom, a waitress, did her best to raise her, but after her grandmother died when Grace was 12, she was mostly on her own. Despite getting good grades in school, Grace believed the only way to escape her circumstances was to find a man who could take care of her. At 19, she married Billy, a guy who quickly lost his job, grew angry and abusive, and drained their savings on alcohol and other women. Things hit rock bottom when Billy suggested she start sharing herself with his friends. The final straw came when he knocked her out after she confronted him about spending their rent money on drugs. 3 months ago, after that last incident, Grace packed her things, took the car, and drove straight to Key West. For 2 months, she lived out of her car until she saved enough to rent a room from a friend. While she spoke, she never looked directly at me. Her story made me realize just how different our lives were. After a long pause, she said, "All I ever wanted was to go to school, become a nurse, and find someone who loved me as much as I loved them. That's the life my grandmother dreamed of for me." For the first time in days, I thought about something other than Rachel. Grace then turned to me and said, "I've seen you, sitting there, feeling sorry for yourself, trying to drink the pain away. But you still love your wife. If you didn't, you'd have already gone off with someone else by now. Since you love her, it's time to fight for her. You're better than this, Jack, and I'm going to help you." Her words took me by surprise. I thought she was interested in a fling, but instead, she was pushing me to get my life back on track. All I could manage to say was, "But how?" Grace looked me dead in the eye. "If you really love her, go back and fight for her. Show her what she stands to lose. And if she still chooses to leave, at least you'll know you did everything you could to save your marriage." Then Grace took charge. She stood up and said, "For the next 24 hours, I'm running the show, but you have to let me." She insisted that I clean myself up, pointing out that I smelled terrible. She also told me I needed to figure out why Rachel cheated and decide what I was going to do about it. We got back to my rundown motel around 3 a.m., and Grace looked around, unimpressed. "This is where you've been staying?" she asked, her tone thick with disappointment. Her reaction made me feel ashamed. She told me to go to bed, adding, "Tomorrow, we're going to start putting your life back together, whatever that means." I collapsed on one bed, and she slept on the other. When I woke up around 10 a.m., Grace was already up, fully dressed, and smiling. "I'm taking the day off work because I have more important things to do today," she said, her smile lifting my spirits slightly. After I took a shower, Grace wrinkled her nose and told me to get back in and shave. "I'm not going out with you looking and smelling like a homeless person," she insisted. After my second shower, she asked, "Where are your other clothes?" I shook my head, embarrassed. "I don't have any. I left home with just these and haven't changed in over a week." Her disgust was obvious, and she nearly gagged. "No way. We're fixing this now," she declared. We headed out to her beat-up 1992 Toyota Corolla, but I refused to ride in it, especially with the passenger door broken. No way. We're taking my car, I said, pointing to my BMW M3 parked nearby. Grace's eyes lit up as she got in, like she'd never been in a luxury car before. I realized then that she probably thought I was just scraping by like she was. We spent the next few hours shopping for new clothes. Oddly enough, it was fun for both of us, more fun than I'd had in days. I ended up dropping $2,500 on new clothes for both of us. It took a solid half hour to convince Grace that I could easily afford it, and that it was my way of thanking her for pulling me out of the darkness, even if it was just for a brief moment. After we packed our shopping bags into the car, we headed for lunch at the Hot Tin Roof, one of the nicest spots in Key West. It was clear Grace had never been to a place like that before. We indulged in steaks, lobster, oysters, and the finest wine. For 3 hours, we just enjoyed ourselves, laughing more than I had in weeks. It was during that slightly tipsy lunch that Grace came up with Operation Jack Retrieval. The plan was simple. I needed to face Rachel and decide what my next move would be. Grace was quickly becoming my unexpected guardian angel, guiding me back to reality. Meanwhile, back home, the moment my credit card was used in Key West, an alert went out to Derek and Sarah. With this new lead, all they had to do was track me down and try to get me to listen to Rachel's side of the story. Time was running out. It had come to light that Peter had drugged Rachel during the retreat, taking advantage of her and snapping photos to blackmail her into getting him promoted to VP of Marketing when they got back to Nashville. How did they find this out? Let's just say, you don't mess with an Atlanta cop bent on revenge. After Peter was arrested, he found himself in an interrogation room with 3 very angry officers. He spilled everything to Sarah, even admitting to tax fraud. Once I got word, I called Sarah and then reached out to Sam for advice on how to break the news to Rachel. She had been spiraling all week, either drinking herself into oblivion or falling apart emotionally. It was only a matter of time before the kids would realize something was off and return home. Or worse, before Rachel lost everything she'd built, including her job and her sanity. Sam suggested a bold plan. Fly to Key West now and find Jack. As his best friend, you're the one who can convince him that what happened wasn't Rachel's fault. He'll listen to you. Get him home before it's too late. Sam also took it upon herself to inform Rachel that Jack's credit card had been used in Key West, and that I was on my way to track him down. She made sure to clarify that finding the card didn't mean we had found Jack, but at least we had a lead, and Rachel's friends were there to support her while we searched. Sarah agreed with the plan but suggested I buy 2 tickets. 2 heads are better than 1 when it comes to finding Jack, she said. Back in Key West, the combination of good food, wine, and great company had lifted my spirits, if only temporarily. For the first time in days, I found myself smiling, even laughing at a few jokes. I felt better, more refreshed. My heart still ached from Rachel's confession, and I knew life would never be the same. But at least I had some hope now that I could move forward. This 23-year-old cocktail waitress, with her own tough life story, had pulled me out of my personal hell and reminded me that I still had a life. One worth living for myself, for my kids, and maybe even for Rachel. When the bill came, I paid it, then turned to Grace and asked, "Have you ever been to Nashville?" She looked puzzled. "No, why?" "I want you to come with me," I said, surprising even myself. "All expenses paid. I need your help and support. You pulled me out of my lowest moment, and now I want to help you out of yours. Come with me when I meet Rachel. You're the only person I trust right now. I don't know the full story of what Rachel did or who knew about it, but you were there for me when I needed it most. Please, come with me." About 30 minutes later, we were back in my BMW, driving north toward Nashville with our bags packed and the road stretching out ahead. In Homestead, I withdrew $350 from an ATM and called my best friend, Derek, from a payphone, letting him know I was alive and on my way back. I told him I expected to reach Nashville in about 2 days. I left a voicemail, then called Sarah to give her the same update. I thought about calling Rachel or Sam, but I wasn't ready for that conversation yet. By 9 p.m., we pulled into a hotel for the night, exhausted from the day of shopping, drinking, and driving. This time, I opted for a 5-star hotel, paying in cash for the room, though we still needed a credit card for the deposit. Grace used hers, as I was still wary of being tracked. I wasn't ready to be found. I was still grieving and felt safer in my anonymity. As we landed in Key West, Derek turned his phone back on, and there it was, a missed call from an unknown number. It was Jack. He'd called from a payphone and left a message saying he was heading back to Nashville, expecting to arrive in 2 days. Saying that Derek was relieved would be an understatement. He tried calling back, but some random couple in Omaha had answered the ringing payphone outside the diner where Jack had called from. Sarah received a similar message from Jack, asking her to let everyone know he was coming home. She immediately called Rachel and Sam, passing along the news. I could practically hear the sigh of relief from Rachel when she learned that Jack was alive and on his way home. It gave her a chance to face him, to explain, and to ask for forgiveness. Sarah pointed out, as bad as this whole situation sounds, Rachel didn't consent to what happened. If Jack can't understand that, then he's not the man we've all known for the past 30 years. And if he can't forgive her, then I'm done with him. After hanging up, Sarah turned to Derek and said, "We've got this. Our old group from the University of Tennessee will handle it, and once things settle down, we'll all be there to make sure everyone comes out the other side. I'm going to find Peter and make him pay for what he did," Sarah declared, her voice filled with determination. We all believed her. Within 2 hours, we had rebooked our flights to Nashville and checked into a hotel. I fell asleep next to Grace, grateful for her support and knowing that if I ever let her down, no one would ever find my body. The day I had dreaded for over a week had finally come. I was going to meet Rachel and get the truth about her affair. My mind raced with questions. What would this conversation be like? Would I have to listen as she told me about the man she slept with? Would she say he was better in bed, or that she let him do things she'd never allowed me to do? Or would she beg for forgiveness, claiming it was a one-time mistake, that she loved only me, and that it didn't mean anything? Just sex didn't mean anything, I thought bitterly. She had let another man take what was supposed to be mine. We had promised to reject everyone else, and she broke that vow. How could I ever forgive her? Even if she said it was a mistake, that she still loved me, how would I ever erase the image of her with another man from my mind? I must have been lost in my thoughts for hours because Grace finally spoke up. "Jack, relax," she said, her voice calm but steady. "What's done is done. There's no point in letting it eat you alive." She encouraged me to open up and talk about what was haunting me so she could help me process it. After I vented all my fears and pain, we crossed the Georgia border, just a few hours from Nashville. At that point, Grace showed a new side of maturity. She offered to drive, so I could make some phone calls from her phone. I think part of her motivation was the chance to drive something nicer than her old Corolla. Who should I call? I asked after we switched seats. "Call a few marriage counselors, see if anyone can help you," she suggested. I hadn't realized you could do therapy over the phone, but with a credit card, anything is possible. After some time, I found a certified marriage counselor, Dr. Blake, who was willing to talk. Initially, she insisted I come to her office, but after I explained my situation, she agreed to have a session over the phone. I poured out the details of the last 2 weeks, and Dr. Blake asked several questions, even directing a few to Grace. I was shocked at how much pain I felt as I talked, but at the same time, I was relieved to let it out. After an hour, I finally asked, "So, what do you think I should do?" Her advice was straightforward. You need to talk to Rachel. Find out what happened, why it happened, and what she wants moving forward. "And then?" I asked. Dr. Blake's response was clear. You have 2 choices. Either she wants to continue your marriage, or she doesn't. If she doesn't, then you need to decide if your life will be better with or without her. I paused, processing her words. And if she does want to stay? I asked. If she wants to stay, and you decide your life is better with her, then the real work begins. You'll need to rebuild the relationship from the ground up, every day for the rest of your life. If either of you stops putting in the effort, you'll end up right back where you are now, and it will eventually lead to divorce. I hung up, stunned. In just 3 hours, I had probably received more clarity than I would have in months of traditional marriage counseling. But now I faced the hardest part, getting through the next 24 hours. As we neared Nashville's Outer Beltway, Dr. Blake offered a simple plan. Give me Rachel's phone number, and I'll call her. I'll try to convince her to meet with you at my office tonight." "Tonight?" I asked, surprised. "Yes, tonight," she replied. The plan was for Grace and me to meet Rachel at Dr. Blake's office, where the confrontation would happen. If Rachel truly believed it had been a mistake and was genuinely sorry, showing up that evening would be a positive sign for our marriage. I agreed. We had a plan in place. Grace and I would head to Dr. Blake's office, and if Rachel showed up, we'd have our showdown. Grace would be there by my side, and I assumed Rachel would probably bring Sam. I wish Derek could be there, but I wasn't sure if he and Sarah knew about the affair and hadn't told me. I gave Dr. Blake Rachel's phone number, and Grace entered the address of Dr. Blake's office into the GPS. Before hanging up, I asked Dr. Blake, "If Rachel doesn't agree to come, please don't tell me over the phone. I don't think I can handle hearing that my marriage is over while I'm still on the road." Meanwhile, back in Nashville, Rachel was living through two of the worst weeks of her life. She had been humiliated, violated by Peter when he took those explicit photos to blackmail her, and she had to confess to me that she had slept with another man. After that, I disappeared for nearly 2 weeks, with no contact. Thankfully, she had good friends. Sam, her best friend, had stayed with her almost every day during that first week, offering comfort as Rachel cried her heart out. Sarah and Derek had been tirelessly searching for me and, in the process, managed to track down Peter, who confessed everything under pressure. With no word from me for over a week, Rachel was hanging on by a thread. I decided to return to work, but it turned out to be a huge mistake. Everyone was buzzing about Peter's arrest. I truly loved Sarah. She was one of the best friends anyone could ask for, but hearing the details about Peter made me break down. I ended up in my boss's office, where I confessed everything. She asked me gently, "Are you still in love with Jack?" After another 10 minutes of crying, I finally managed to say, "Yes, more than anything. If only I could tell him it was all a mistake, how much I love him. I could fix this. I'm good at fixing things. I'm your best employee. I could do it." My boss looked at me and replied, "Some things are more important than work. Your faith and your family come first. Go find your husband, hug him, and do whatever it takes to show him how much you love him, even more than the day you got married. When you've done that, your job will be waiting for you. We're family, and we'll support you. Everyone except Peter." With that, I left her office, ready to start rebuilding my marriage. But the next few days were agonizingly slow. They were filled with tears, heartache, and way too much wine to help me sleep. My friends stayed close, but despite our efforts, there was still no sign of Jack. After his call from Key West, we knew he was coming back, but there had been no trace of him since. Then, one evening around 8 p.m., the phone rang. The call came from a number I didn't recognize. I thought it might be Derek and Sarah calling from Florida, but when I answered and put it on speaker for Sam to hear, I prayed it would be Jack. Instead, a woman's voice introduced herself. "Hi, this is Dr. Blake." Sam and I exchanged confused glances. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to make sense of it all. "I'm Jack's therapist," Dr. Blake explained. "Therapist?" Sam whispered, as shocked as I was. A whirlwind of thoughts raced through my head. Therapist? How long had Jack been seeing a therapist? Had our problems been worse than I realized? Therapist? I repeated out loud, trying to process the news. After a brief pause, Dr. Blake clarified, "I'm Jack's marriage counselor." Marriage counselor. My heart sank even further. My husband had been seeing a marriage counselor, and I didn't even know. I had only just confessed my infidelity, and now it felt like our marriage was slipping further out of my control. Dr. Blake continued after another pause, giving me space to respond. "Jack hired me 3 hours ago, and he's on his way to my office with Grace." Grace. I blurted out, alarm bells ringing in my head. Who is Grace? Sam and I exchanged frantic looks, my mind racing to the worst possible conclusion. Did Jack find someone else? Was this revenge? Sensing the tension, Sam asked calmly, "Who is Grace?" Dr. Blake replied, "She's his travel companion." Travel companion? The words barely registered. My stomach churned with fear and jealousy. Was Grace some new woman Jack had found in Key West? "Why are you calling me?" Sam asked directly, keeping her cool. Dr. Blake's response was clear and calm. Jack is struggling with the news you gave him over a week ago. He's processing everything, trying to understand what your marriage means and whether it has a future. He's on his way to my office for a counseling session, and he asked me to invite you to join him if you want to discuss the possibility of continuing the marriage. He's not making any promises, but he's willing to listen and talk. My heart pounded as I tried to comprehend what she was saying. Dr. Blake continued, "The session starts in 48 minutes. My office is in the Thurston Building, 3rd floor. You're welcome to join if you're ready." "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, and with that, Dr. Blake hung up. 48 minutes. Thurston Building. Grace. Who is Grace? My mind was spinning. What should I wear? What should I say? Would Jack even believe me? Was divorce inevitable? Who was this Grace? I should have been more focused on saving my marriage, but I couldn't stop thinking about Grace. Thankfully, Sam had her head on straight. She rushed upstairs and came back with Jack's favorite little black dress, along with my 4-inch heels and some black tights. She shoved them into my hands. "Get dressed," she ordered, almost yelling. "If you're going down, do it with dignity. Show Jack the woman he fell in love with and married." While I dressed, Sam called Derek and Sarah, who had just gotten back from their flight from Key West. She told them to meet us at the Thurston Building. "Jack needs to hear the truth from someone he trusts, and that's Derek," she said firmly. Once I was dressed, Sam dragged me into the car and told me to start putting on my makeup. I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked like I had aged 15 years in just 2 weeks. I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. As we raced to get there in time, I checked my watch, 42 minutes left to make it to the far side of Nashville. Impossible, I thought, even with no traffic. Just then, I noticed an Atlanta police car behind us, and Sam whispered, "Thank God." There was a chance we might actually make it. A few minutes later, Sam's phone rang, and she put it on speaker. It was Sarah. She said, "Follow the car with the blue lights. Don't stop for anything. I love you." Within seconds, a car with flashing blue lights sped past us, and we followed it like our lives depended on it. We were flying down the highway at over 105 miles per hour, and Sam was gripping the wheel for dear life. As we neared the Thurston Building, the police car turned off its lights and slowed down, letting us pass as we pulled into the parking lot. We arrived just a few minutes before the session was supposed to start. I bolted out of the car and ran to the entrance. The elevator felt too slow, so I sprinted up the stairs, Sam barely keeping up. 3 floors and 4-inch heels felt like a marathon, but I couldn't stop now. When we finally reached Dr. Blake's office, I flung the door open. Sitting in the waiting room was a young, attractive, well-dressed woman. We locked eyes. She must have been Grace. No one said a word. I felt like a lioness, ready to pounce, standing across from another, both of us silently vying for dominance. The young woman who must have been Grace stood up, walked over to me with surprising grace, extended her hand and said, "Hi, you must be Rachel." "I'm Grace. I've heard so much about you and your family from Jack. You're even more beautiful than he described." I blinked, completely taken aback, unsure what to make of her friendly tone. Grace continued, "Jack's with Dr. Blake now. They're waiting for you inside." She smiled warmly before gesturing toward the door. So here I was, sitting in a comfortable chair in Dr. Blake's office, feeling my heart sink lower with every passing minute, worried Rachel wouldn't show up. My hand trembled as I settled the financial matters with Dr. Blake and learned a bit about her. 20 years in practice, a Duke Medical School graduate, highly respected. In the 5 minutes I'd been there, she'd managed to calm me down and reassure me that whatever happened next, we'd get through it together. I wasn't alone. Then the door opened. My heart stopped as I saw Rachel walk in. There she was, the woman I had shared so many memories with. Memories flashed through my mind like a fast-forwarded film. The highs, the lows, everything we'd been through together. This was the woman who had turned my life upside down with a single confession. My first thought as I saw her was, she looks exhausted. Even with makeup, it was clear she hadn't slept in days. She was wearing my favorite dress, her little black one with the 4-inch heels. Damn, she looked good. Sexy. The same word popped into my mind, bitterly. Isn't that what got her into this mess? Looking sexy for someone else? Is that how it started? I caught myself spiraling into a dark place and forced my thoughts back to what Dr. Blake had told me. Listen first. Don't let your imagination tear you apart. Rachel approached me, her eyes red from crying. She reached out to hug me, but I raised my hand to stop her. I wasn't ready for that. I was still angry, and until I heard why she had betrayed me, why she had destroyed us, I didn't want her to touch me. She stepped back, visibly hurt, and tears started streaming down her face as she sat across from me. Dr. Blake broke the heavy silence. She introduced herself to Rachel and briefly explained her background in clinical psychology. Then, she turned to Rachel, her expression calm but serious, and said, "Rachel, can you tell Jack exactly what happened? He needs to understand it, to process it, and then tell him whether you still want this marriage to continue or if you think it's time to end it." I could feel the weight of Dr. Blake's words. This is it, I thought. She doesn't want to touch me, and I don't know if she even wants me anymore. If this is the end, at least I'll know I tried. Rachel took a deep breath and locked eyes with me, just like she had the first time I saw her at that party so many years ago. Her voice was soft but steady. "Jack, I was drugged at the retreat. Peter took advantage of me. He manipulated me into thinking we were having an affair and took photos of me to blackmail me. But it was all lies. He's been arrested, confessed to everything, and Sean and Sarah should be here soon to confirm it all. That's the truth." She paused, then added with a sharp edge to her voice, "And who the hell is Grace?" The room seemed to tilt on its axis. My emotions spiraled from one extreme to the next. Confusion, anger, hatred, mostly toward Peter, but also a lot of self-hatred. How had I not been there to protect her? Why did I leave her alone when she needed me most? I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. My body gave out, and I collapsed onto the floor, crying uncontrollably at Rachel's feet. All I could think was that I had failed her, failed us. I wasn't there for her, and now everything was falling apart. Rachel watched in stunned silence as her husband, her rock, her lover, lay curled up on the floor, sobbing like a broken man. She didn't know what to do. All the emotions she had suppressed over the past 2 weeks surged forward. Anger, disgust, sympathy, love. Was this the man I'd loved for most of my life? What is he feeling? She glanced at Dr. Blake, who sat wide-eyed, clearly not expecting this reaction. Then, the doors swung open, and Sam and Grace rushed in, startled by the commotion. They looked down at Jack lying on the floor, then back at Rachel, unsure what to say or do. A few moments later, Derek and Sarah entered, standing frozen in the doorway, jaws dropping as they took in the scene, clearly wondering what on earth they had missed. It felt like an eternity passed, though it had only been seconds. Grace broke the silence, looking at Rachel and asking, "What did you say to him?" Rachel, still dazed, replied softly, "I told him the truth, that Peter drugged and blackmailed me." Grace nodded, her expression unreadable. Then, with a calmness that surprised everyone, she knelt down beside Jack and hugged him gently, whispering into his ear, "Listen to me, you idiot. She loves you. She's loved you this whole time, like I told you. What happened wasn't her fault, and it had nothing to do with you." Jack looked up at Grace, his eyes wet with tears, and for the first time in 2 weeks, something shifted in him. I heard my husband's voice breaking as he spoke. It was my job to protect her, and I failed. I failed her when she needed me most, and I failed her again when I jumped to conclusions and left. His words were heavy with guilt. Grace looked him directly in the eyes and said firmly, "That's nonsense, Jack. No, it's not your fault. Sure, you could have handled it better when she first told you, but you freaked out and ran. Now look where that got you. I've heard you talk for days about how, if you had another chance to show Rachel how much you loved her, you'd do anything. So, stop feeling sorry for yourself, get up, kiss your wife, and fight for her." We all stood there, astonished by this young woman's wisdom and boldness. Jack wiped his eyes, stood up, and slowly knelt before me. He looked me straight in the eyes and asked, "Rachel, will you forgive me? Will you be my wife, forever, from this day forward?" Tears filled my eyes as I whispered, "Yes. Oh God, yes. I love you. I missed you so much." I pulled Jack to his feet and kissed him deeply, letting all the hurt, anger, and love spill out in that moment. When we finally pulled apart, I saw that everyone in the room had tears in their eyes. Derek grabbed Jack and pulled him into a bear hug. Sam and Sarah rushed to my side, wrapping me in their arms. I glanced at Dr. Blake, who was discreetly wiping away her own tears. She smiled warmly and said, "Well, on one hand, my work here is done. But on the other, I think we'll need to meet at least twice a week for a while. This is just the beginning. You'll have ups and downs, but I truly believe you'll come out of this stronger and more in love." Then, I turned to Grace. I didn't fully know who she was yet, but it was clear she had saved not just my husband, but also my marriage. I pulled her into a hug, feeling a deep gratitude for this woman who had done so much for us. After I let her go, I looked at Jack, silently asking for an explanation. He smiled and said, "Rachel, let me officially introduce you to Tanya, though she's gone by Grace until now. She's been through a lot and needs our help." I was surprised but nodded. It was a lot to take in, but after everything that had happened, helping someone else seemed like the right thing to do. When we left Dr. Blake's office that night and went home, Tanya naturally came with us. She had officially met all our friends, and we spent hours talking about everything that had happened over the past few weeks. There were plenty of tears, laughter, and moments when emotions overwhelmed us. Tanya shared her story last, telling us about what had happened since the day Jack left Nashville. She had become a part of our lives, and by the end of the evening, Rachel and our friends were practically begging her to stay in Atlanta. It was Rachel who suggested Tanya move into the apartment above our garage, so she could get her life back on track and start pursuing her dreams. As the night wound down, Rachel and I sat together, drinking wine and talking until the early hours of the morning, a conversation we should have had long before. It was clear that our marriage had been through hell, but we were determined to move forward. Tanya moved into the apartment, and when I asked her about her belongings back in Florida, she told me all she had were the new clothes and the BMW. Tony, our friend and lawyer, took on her case, even though Tanya didn't want anything from her divorce. Tony made sure her ex, Billy, paid dearly for what he had done to her. Tanya's next challenge was going back to school. She studied hard, passed her exams, and was accepted into Emory University's prestigious School of Nursing. It was expensive, but Rachel and I offered to help with the costs, and we let her stay in the apartment rent-free until she graduated. A few years later, our children, Ryan and Jessica, found out about the struggles Rachel and I had faced. It was right before Thanksgiving when they came home and discovered Tanya living in the apartment above the garage. Rachel sat them down and explained everything, telling them that if it hadn't been for Tanya, I might not have survived Key West. I probably would have drunk myself to death, and for that, Rachel said, we owed Tanya a great deal. At first, it was a little awkward between them, but after a few hours, Ryan, Jessica, and Tanya were laughing and talking as if they'd known each other forever. Ryan graduated from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte and became a pharmacist, while Jessica spent 2 years in AAA baseball before taking a job as an engineer at a small firm in Marietta. Tanya graduated from Emory with her nursing degree, started a family, and went on to work at one of Atlanta's top hospitals, thanks to a recommendation from Dr. Blake. I had the honor of walking both Jessica and Tanya down the aisle at their weddings. As for Rachel and me, we had our rough patches, but we pushed through. No one can go through the kind of trauma we did without scars. We saw Dr. Blake regularly for over a year, and as you can imagine, there were plenty of difficult moments. Sometimes there was silence, sometimes accusations, and of course, arguments. But we also made up, and the connection between us grew stronger. The intimacy we rebuilt was incredible, but it wasn't easy. About a year later, I came home one day and noticed Rachel wasn't smoking or drinking wine on the back porch anymore. It felt like a sign that things were finally settling down. She stopped having nightmares, and I was fully committed to making our future together work. As for Peter, he was eventually released on parole a few years later. Rachel was nervous at first, so I suggested she see Dr. Blake on her own to deal with any lingering anxiety. I worried that the nightmares might return or that she might start smoking again. I was afraid that everything we'd rebuilt could come crashing down. Then, one day, Peter simply disappeared. Rachel was anxious, unsure what it meant, but when Beth asked to speak to her privately, everything changed. After their conversation, Rachel seemed much more at peace. That night, I asked her what Beth had said. Rachel smiled softly and replied, "Beth just told me not to worry about him. She said, 'Don't stress, honey. I don't think the body will ever be found.